Hi, it's Dr. Johnson, and let's talk a little bit about culture and what that means for the elementary classroom teacher. Now, as a student at BYU Hawaii, there's really no need to give you the definition of culture. I think you understand it really well, and I think most people have a good idea what culture is. So let's focus in on what a teacher might have or questions they may have about culture. Like, how important is it if I have a highly diverse class versus if I don't have a diverse classroom? Or maybe the question is, how do I get students to talk comfortably about their culture and to share interesting things about their culture with others? Or how do I, handle the politically correct, incorrect things about culture? And more importantly, are there things that I shouldn't be talking about in the classroom? Because culture could encompass some really sensitive topics like religion and sexual preference and race. There's a lot of hot points in there. So my goal is to really help you get from being the okay teacher with culture to be a really good teacher. And to do that, I'm going to use Paul Gorski's Stages of Multicultural Transformation to get you from the beginning novice to the expert. Although it is going to take some work, and there is no way we're going to be able to get you there in just this class. This is going to be something you'll work on for your entire teaching career. So let's talk about stage number 1. It's the curriculum of the mainstream. This is where most people start. They're teaching about culture. They're probably using a textbook, maybe some standard materials, but it's really from kind of an Eurocentric or a male-centric point of view. It's kind of not the preferred way to do it, but it's the way that we're used to because, as Roald Dahl, one of my favorite authors, says, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm big, you're small, and we do what we know. For instance, we all have our own perspectives, and you teach from the perspective that you have. And sometimes we don't know that there are other perspectives because we're like the blind scientist studying the elephant. And if we only have the perspective of holding onto the tail and we can't see those other perspectives, it's really hard to say that it's anything more than a rope. So our perspective is very natural. It's very it's part of almost our DNA, and it's okay to have that, but just realize that a cultural rule that might help you out is that the realization that you have cultural bias. Be aware of your common misconceptions and your common shift to be preferential to your own culture and the way you grew up and those things. If you understand that, you're ready to take step number 2. And for step number 2, Gorski calls it the holidays and heroes step. And this is where people think, I should be teaching more cultural relevant things in my classroom, so I'll teach about some important holidays from some other cultures or groups. Or we'll have some heroes that we can represent for multicultural diversity and things. And this is a great step number 2. But unfortunately, most people take it from the iceberg point of view. So think about culture as an iceberg. There are things that we see above the water, but there is so much under the water that we don't see. And when we think of this in terms of culture, the things that we often see above the water are the things that we're used to, especially here at BYU Hawaii. When we celebrate culture, we have Food Fest. We have Culture Night. And it's easy to see the food and taste the food, and it's easy to see the dance and the clothing. It's easy to see architecture. There are some very easy things to see about culture, but a lot of what we see about culture is under the water. So think about culture as this iceberg. Remember, there's lots of things under there that you're never going to see, and you're never going to really understand because you don't see them. For instance, when I was in Hong Kong, I never understood why we always sat around at dinner when I was meeting with all of our alumni, and I had hosted dinner at a restaurant, and we would talk, and the food would be served, and we would talk, and we would talk, and we would talk. And then finally someone would say, Dr. Johnson, would you like some? And they would give me some food, and I would say, thank you, and I would start eating, and then everyone would begin eating, and I didn't understand the cultural relevance of that, the cultural significance of the respect for me as their college professor who was visiting and how that influenced culture. And there are other parts of culture we never see. We just don't see family values. We don't see maybe some of the social mores and norms related to death and dying. We don't see a lot of those maybe governmental values that are spread throughout. So in culture, remember this rule: which is there's a lot more below the surface than we can ever teach in one lesson, book, or experience. And if you realize that, if you're thinking about that, then you're ready to move on to step number 3. And step number 3 is a really great step. It's the integration step. And this is where we say, we're going to start adding some more materials, especially about non-dominant groups, about other cultures into my classroom. And that's a great thing to do. But the problem with this often is it's very hard to find materials. For instance, in 2012, if I wanted to add some books about Polynesian culture into my classroom, there weren't a lot of children's books written in 2012 about Polynesian culture. In fact, take a look at the Asian Americans. 2% of the children's books written in 2012 published in the U.S. were about Asia Pacific Americans. Not a whole lot there. Now in 2020 that changed. Look, that jumped all the way up to 7%. But we realized that Mulan came out, so there's a reason for that jump up to 7%. But look at the poor Native American students. If you wanted to have Native American representation, American Indians, only 1% of the materials, only 23 books in 2018 had a character that was primarily Native American, whereas 27% of those books, 864, had animals as the main character. So it might be hard to find materials of what you want to integrate. And the second thing you have to realize when you're integrating these other materials is you still have a perspective. And it's really hard to change your perspective. As much as you want to, you may not be able to change that perspective, and that's okay. But if you're trying to integrate more materials, you're doing a good job. You realize you still have that perspective, and you're probably introducing those from your own perspective. Then you, I think, are ready to move on to step number 4, which is structural reform. And this is where you say, hey, I don't understand everything I need to about some different cultures, so I need to get some different perspectives. I'm going to talk to some parents in my class and maybe have them explain to me as a teacher some things I can do to better understand their cultural perspective or their students' cultural backgrounds. Maybe I'm reading some materials. Maybe I'm looking at some places on the internet going, I want to do more with American Indians and understanding that perspective in my classroom. So I might be reading Debbie Reese's website where she has a lot of good insight onto that. Or maybe looking at the Social Justice Books website for recommendations on books maybe about Arabic culture because I want to integrate that into my classroom. But we're doing this because we have that realization that I can't change my perspective, but I can get other people's perspectives to help me out. This is really a great step for you as a pre-service educator to get to. If you can get to this step, it's a really great place to be. After this step, you start getting into step number 5, the social action and awareness step. And this is really a hard step to move into. Even it can be even really hard for classroom teachers because it's asking teachers to start integrating more important, complex issues. How do you talk to students about Black Lives Matter movement, about social injustices? If you're in Hong Kong, how do you talk to them about the umbrella movement? Those are very complex things to talk about, and oftentimes teachers find that they don't have the resources or the time or maybe even the courage to find out how to do these. And that's not bad, but just realize that that's the 5th step, is really moving on to more of that. So hopefully now you have kind of some stages that you can get to of where you want to go. Notice that stage 1, curriculum in the mainstream, we want you to not use that a whole lot. Start integrating heroes and holidays, start integrating more materials as you find them, and then really getting a structural reform, bringing in perspectives that you just don't have because you know you need them in order to be an effective multicultural teacher. Thanks so much for joining me today, and go out there and find some great books about multicultural perspectives.